My grandmother's reading glasses were on the kitchen table. That was the first thing I noticed when I walked in. Not her, not my cousin. The glasses sitting next to a stack of papers I had never seen before, with a pen laid across the top like someone had just finished signing something. I should back up. My grandmother turned 81 in February. She still gardens. She still makes her own bread on Sunday mornings. And she still calls me every Thursday at 7, because that is what we have done since I was 9 years old, and my parents were going through their divorce, and she was the one steady thing in my life. Her name is Dorothy, but everyone who loves her calls her Dot. My cousin Marcus and his wife Leanne moved back to town about 2 years ago. Marcus is the kind of person who shows up when there is something to gain and disappears when there is work to do. I say that not to be cruel. I say it because it is the most accurate description of the pattern I have watched repeat itself my entire life, and the kindest way I have found to say it without lying. I am 32 years old. I work in accounting. I am not dramatic. I do not enjoy conflict. I am the person at family gatherings who quietly refills the water pitcher and makes sure the elderly relatives have somewhere comfortable to sit. That is who I am. I want you to understand that before I tell you what happened, because what I did next was not something I did lightly. 3 years ago, my grandmother almost lost her house. She had owned it for 44 years. A 3-bedroom on a corner lot in a quiet part of town, with a rose garden along the front walkway that she and my grandfather planted together the summer they moved in. My grandfather passed 11 years ago. After he was gone, the house became the thing she held on to. Every Sunday dinner we had there, every Christmas, every birthday. The house was not just a house. It was the physical shape of everything our family had been. What happened was this. A contractor my grandmother had hired to fix a roof leak turned the job into something much larger than it needed to be. By the time she understood what she had agreed to, she owed $62,000 she did not have. She did not tell anyone for several months. By the time she told me, there was a lien on the property. I want to be honest about something. At the time I found out I had just paid off my own car loan, I had a small amount of savings, and I was not in a position to absorb $62,000 without it changing my life significantly. I thought about it for 3 days. I ran every number I could run. I thought about what it would mean to watch her lose that house. I thought about the rose garden. Then I called my bank. I paid off the lien. I covered the full amount, plus the legal fees to clear the title. I also had the roof properly repaired by a different contractor, which cost another $9,000. Total, between the lien payoff, the legal fees, and the repair, I spent just over $74,000. I did not tell my grandmother exactly how much it was. I told her I had handled it, and that the house was safe. She cried. She tried to give me her jewelry, and I would not take it. She asked me every few months for the next year if she owed me anything, and I told her every time that she did not. I did not tell Marcus. I did not tell Marcus, because Marcus had not called my grandmother in 7 months at the point when I found out about the lien. I did not tell him because his name had never appeared on a single document, a single payment, a single conversation about her care in as long as I could remember. I did not tell him because I did not think it was his business. And if I am being fully honest, I did not tell him because some part of me already knew, in the quiet way you know things you do not want to know, that telling him would cause a problem I was not prepared for at the time. I should have been more prepared. Let me tell you about Leanne. Leanne is the kind of person who asks a lot of questions that are not really questions. She asks them in a soft voice, tilting her head slightly, and by the time she is done, you feel as though you have been examined rather than spoken to. The first time I met her, at Marcus and Leanne's engagement party, she asked me what I did for work, and then said, "Oh, so basically like a bookkeeper?" and smiled. I said, "No, more like a CPA," and she smiled again and turned away. She remembers every piece of information she has ever given. I know this because she has brought up things years later in conversations where those things had no business appearing. She is strategic in the way that people are strategic when they believe no one is paying attention to them. I was paying attention. About 4 months ago, I started noticing small things. My grandmother mentioned that Marcus and Leanne had been coming by more often. "It's so nice," she said. "They've been helping me with some things around the house." I asked what kind of things. She said Leanne had offered to help her organize some paperwork. I said, "What kind of paperwork?" And she said, "Oh, just some old files." Leanne said it would be good to have everything in order at my age. At my age? I asked my grandmother casually over the next few weeks about the visits. She seemed pleased by the attention. She mentioned that Leanne had asked her a lot of questions about the house when she bought it, what it was worth now, whether she had a will, whether the will had been updated recently. My grandmother answered all of these questions openly, because she is a trusting woman who sees the best in people and because, in her mind, Leanne was simply being helpful. I made a phone call to an estate attorney I had worked with through my firm. I explained the situation in general terms. She told me that what I was describing, a family member with potential inheritance interest conducting informal financial conversations with an elderly relative, was a pattern she had seen before. She told me what to do. I want to be clear about something. I did not yet know that anything had actually happened. I was operating on instinct and on a low hum of unease that I had learned over the course of my life to take seriously. There was no document I had seen, no conversation I had overheard. I was working from the look on my grandmother's face when she talked about Leanne helping with her paperwork, a look that was warm and grateful, in a way that made something in my chest go tight. I spent 2 weekends doing what my attorney advised me to do. I gathered every document related to the lien payoff, the bank records, the wire transfer confirmation, the title clearance, the contractor invoices, the legal correspondence. I organized everything and I made copies and I put them in a folder that I kept in my car. I also had a conversation with my grandmother. I asked her, gently, whether she had signed anything recently that she wanted me to look over. She said no, nothing important. She said Leanne had just helped her find some old files. She seemed a little uncertain when she said it, in the way she sometimes gets when she is not quite sure what she remembers, and I decided not to push it. 2 weeks later, my grandmother called me on a Tuesday, not a Thursday. She said Marcus and Leanne were coming to dinner on Saturday and asked if I would come too. She said it almost like a question, the way she asks things when she wants backup but does not want to say she needs it. I said yes. I arrived at 6. Marcus's truck was already in the driveway. The lights were on in the living room. I walked in and my grandmother was at the stove. She looked over her shoulder when she heard the door, and the expression on her face when she saw me was one of the most complicated things I have ever seen on a person. Relief, discomfort, love, a faint trace of something that looked like shame, though she had nothing to be ashamed of. Marcus was sitting at the kitchen table. Leanne was next to him. In front of them was a spread of documents, printed pages, some with tabs sticking out of the sides, the kind of organized presentation you put together when you want to make something look official. Leanne looked up at me and smiled. "Oh, good, you made it," she said, as though she had been expecting me and had planned for my presence. That should have been my first indication of how she had read the situation. Marcus said, "Hey." He did not get up. I put my bag down and helped my grandmother carry the food to the table. We sat down. My grandmother served everyone. For a few minutes, it was just the sound of forks and polite questions about work, about the weather, about nothing. Then Marcus cleared his throat. He said that he and Leanne had been spending a lot of time with Grandma Dot lately, and that they had gotten concerned, as family, about her long-term situation. He said they wanted to make sure she was protected. He said the house was a significant asset, and that it didn't make sense for it to just be sitting in her name without any kind of plan around it. I put my fork down. Leanne took over from there. She explained, in her soft, tilted head voice, that they had done some research, and that it would be in everyone's best interest, she said everyone's, looking briefly at me when she said it, if the property were transferred into a shared family trust. She said it would protect my grandmother from estate taxes. She said it would make things simpler when the time came. She slid one of the tabbed documents across the table toward my grandmother. My grandmother looked at it. Then she looked at me. I said, "Can I see that?" Leanne said, "Of course," in the tone of someone who believes they have already won. It was a deed transfer. It would have moved the property from my grandmother's name into a trust with 3 named beneficiaries, my grandmother, Marcus, and Leanne. Not me. Specifically not me. My grandmother's ownership would have become 1/3. Marcus and Leanne together would have held the other 2/3. There was a signature line at the bottom with my grandmother's name printed beneath it, and from the slight crease on the paper, it had already been placed in front of her at least once before tonight. The room was very quiet. My grandmother said, "It did seem like it might be a good idea to have things organized." I said, "Grandma, do you know what this document does?" She looked at it again. She said, "It puts the house into a trust." I said, "It transfers 67% of the ownership of your house to Marcus and Leanne. You would keep 1/3. They would be able to make decisions about the property, including selling it with their combined share outvoting yours." My grandmother went still. Marcus said, That's a simplified way of putting it. It's for protection." I said, "Whose protection?" He said, "The family's." I said, "I'd like to ask you something, Marcus. When was the last time you talked to her before these visits started? Not texted. Called. Actually called." He did not answer. Leanne said, in a very controlled voice. We're not here to argue. We're here because we care about Dorothy's future. I said, I know you're not here to argue. I reached into my bag and took out the folder. I set it on the table. I want to share some information with you both, and then I'd like you to explain to me how this conversation makes sense. I took out the wire transfer confirmation first. I set it in the center of the table, $74,000, with the date and the payee information visible. My grandmother made a small sound. Marcus looked at it. His expression shifted not into shame, not yet, but into something recalibrating. I said, 3 years ago, my grandmother had a lien on this property for $62,000. She was at risk of losing the house. I paid it off. I paid the legal fees to clear the title. I paid for the roof repair that the contractor had mishandled. The total was $74,000 and some change. I paused. You did not know about this because you were not involved in her life at that point. That is not a criticism. It is a fact. I took out the title clearance document, then the attorney correspondence, then the contractor invoices. I laid them out in a row. I said, this house, which you would like to become a 2/3 owner of, is free and clear because of those documents. If I had not intervened, it would have gone to a creditor's auction. There would be nothing to transfer. Leanne was looking at the documents with an expression I had not seen on her before. It was the expression of someone who had prepared for a version of events that was not the version they were currently inside. Marcus said, I didn't know about any of that. I said, I know you didn't. I'm telling you now. My grandmother was looking at her hands. She said quietly. She wouldn't let me tell anyone. She said it was handled. I said, it was handled. And Grandma, I want to be clear, I didn't tell you this to make you feel obligated. I told you then that you didn't owe me anything, and I still believe that. But I am telling everyone in this room tonight because context matters. I looked at Marcus. I looked at Leanne. I said, if you have genuine concerns about my grandmother's estate planning, I would encourage you to suggest she work with an attorney. She has one. I can give you the name. That attorney can help her set up whatever structure is actually in her best interest, not a document drafted informally and presented to her at a dinner table. Leanne said, we had an attorney look at it. I said, which attorney? She named someone. I did not know the firm. I said, then you won't mind if Grandma has her own attorney review it before she signs anything. A long silence followed. My grandmother was still looking at her hands. Then she looked up at me, and something in her face had settled. The uncertain, slightly confused expression was gone. She looked like herself again, the woman who has been gardening and baking bread and calling me every Thursday for 23 years. She said, I won't be signing that. Marcus looked at her. He said, Grandma? She said, I won't be signing it tonight. If I decide to do any kind of planning, I'll do it with Patricia. Patricia is her attorney, and I'll do it on my own time. She picked up her fork. She said, does anyone want more bread? The dinner ended the way. Dinners like that always end. Not with shouting, not with dramatic exits, just with a long and uncomfortable quiet, and then the scrape of chairs, and then Marcus and Leanne's headlights pulling out of the driveway while I stood at the kitchen window watching. My grandmother and I did the dishes together. We did not talk about what had happened right away. She washed and I dried, and she told me about a bird that had been coming to her feeder, a kind she didn't recognize, and she described it in careful detail, the color of its wings, the way it tilted its head. When we were done, she sat down at the kitchen table with her hands around a cup of tea. I sat across from her. She said, I think I knew something didn't feel right. I just didn't want to believe it. I said, I know. She said, she kept asking about the will. Not once. Many times. I said, I know. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I want to call Patricia this week. I want to get things actually in order, the right way. She looked at me. Would you help me with that? I said yes. We updated her estate plan the following month. She worked with her attorney to establish a proper trust, an irrevocable trust, with terms she understood that protected the property from any future claims and that reflected what she actually wanted. Not what someone at a dinner table had suggested to her with tabbed documents and soft questions. She put the house in the trust with herself as the sole beneficiary during her lifetime. She updated her will. She also, at her own decision, added a right of survivorship arrangement that she felt reflected her actual wishes, none of which I will detail here because they are her private decisions and no one else's business. Marcus called me about a week after that dinner. He said he wanted me to know that they had just been trying to help. He said Leanne had read some things online about estate planning for elderly relatives. He said he was sorry if it came across the wrong way. I told him I appreciated the call. I told him the best thing he could do for our grandmother was to call her. Not about paperwork, just to call her. Tell her about his week. Ask about the bird at her feeder. I don't know if he took that advice. What I know is that my grandmother called me on a Thursday, the way she always does, 2 days after the trust paperwork was finalized. She called at 7, the way she always does. She said she had made bread that morning and that it turned out well, and she had figured out the bird a yellow warbler, she said, which she had never had at that feeder before. She said, I feel better. About everything. I feel like things are in order now. I told her I was glad. She said, I used to worry about what would happen to this house after I'm gone, whether it would cause problems, whether people would fight. She paused. I don't worry about that anymore. Outside her kitchen window, the rose garden she planted with my grandfather 44 years ago was just beginning to come back in for the spring. She had told me that the winter had been hard on it, but that most of the roots had held. Most of the roots had held. That is all she needed to tell me.